Flying high over Berlin on April 17, 1945, Ivan Kozhedub maneuvered his LA-7 with the precision that had made him the Soviet Union's most feared ace. He rushed in aid of a group of American B-17 flying fortresses under attack by Luftwaffe fighters defending their capital. As Kozhedub chased away the German attackers, tracer rounds suddenly flashed past his cockpit. He turned sharply, scanning the air around him. To his shock, a group of American P-51 Mustangs had mistaken his LA-7 for an enemy aircraft. Kozhedub tried to signal his identity, but the American pilots kept coming, their guns blazing. Alone and outnumbered, Kozhedub banked sharply, dodging another burst of .50 caliber gunfire. As he leveled out, the pilot who had downed dozens of German aircraft faced an impossible choice: shoot down his allies or risk being shot down himself. Despite graduating at the top of his class at the military pilot school near Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine, Ivan Kozhedub was not allowed to fight for his country. In 1942, while the skies over the Eastern Front were constantly alive with the roar of engines and the flash of gunfire, the Ukrainian native was deemed too valuable to lose in battle. As a 22-year-old sergeant, Kozhedub found himself grounded as an instructor in a base in Central Asia. For more than a year, he watched his trainees take off, some never to return, others bringing back stories of downing Nazi aircraft. The months dragged on, and his frustration kept growing. Quote, "I requested a transfer to the front more than once, but the front required well-trained flyers." But as he shaped others for combat, he was also training himself, preparing for the day he'd finally face the enemy head-on. Later that same year, Kozhedub was sent to a facility to learn how to fly a new aircraft, the Lavochkin LA-5. A leap forward for Soviet aviation. With its powerful M82 radial engine, this new model offered superior speed and maneuverability, especially at lower altitudes. Unlike the outdated Soviet models, it could match the German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs in tight turns and rapid climbs, the perfect aircraft for the kind of aggressive dogfighting that dominated the Eastern Front. Once he mastered the new aircraft and tactics, opportunity came knocking. In March 1943, the Red Army, desperate for skilled pilots, finally posted Senior Sergeant Kozhedub to the 240th Fighter Air Regiment. The 240th was no ordinary unit. They'd been fighting since the day Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Many of its pilots were graduates of the same Kozhedub school, where Kozhedub had once been an instructor. Despite his initial nerves, he soon found himself among familiar faces: Belarusians, Tatars, Georgians, Russians, and Ukrainians, all part of what he called one big family. It was the ideal environment to channel his skills and turn potential into real combat experience. On March 26th, Kozhedub climbed into the cockpit of his LA-5 for his first combat mission. That morning, the cold early spring air bit through his flight suit as he guided the aircraft into formation. Everything felt perfect. It wasn't long before his squadron spotted two Messerschmitt Bf-109s diving out of the sun. Thinking he could down a couple of enemy planes in one go, the adrenaline-fueled pilot lined up his gun sight on one of the German fighters, inching closer and closer. Out of nowhere, a group of Messerschmitt Bf-110s appeared above and behind him, and as his aircraft shuddered under a hail of gunfire, he realized he'd been so focused on his target that he failed to notice the oncoming threat. Realizing he was caught in a trap, Kozhedub wrestled the control stick, trying to pull his battered fighter out of the line of fire. With great difficulty, and his LA-5 riddled with bullet holes, he managed to break away and limp back to base. The mission had ended in disaster. His aircraft was a total loss. But instead of criticism, his commander praised his skill in landing the crippled fighter. For Kozhedub, it was a harsh lesson. Raw skill alone wasn't enough. He needed patience and discipline. This setback only fueled his resolve. Quote, "Despite general failures, our morale was quite high. Many, like myself, had their families in Nazi-occupied territory. We were all thirsting for revenge." Despite his late start, Ivan Kozhedub joined the war just in time for the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, where the Luftwaffe ruled the skies, cutting down Soviet forces mercilessly. But as the war escalated, so did Soviet tactics. 2 years of brutal conflict with the Luftwaffe had brought the Soviet Air Force to develop specialized formations and countermeasures to weaken the enemy's grip. Likewise, Kozhedub was not about to let his earlier fiasco repeat itself. On July 6, 1943, as his squadron climbed into the skies over Kursk, Kozhedub spotted a Ju-87 Stuka breaking from the enemy formation. Pushing the throttle, closing in fast, and ignoring the chaos around him, he lined up the shot and squeezed the trigger. A burst tore through the bomber's tail, and the Stuka began to spiral down in flames, trailing smoke before crashing into the fields below. His first victory. As the Battle of Kursk raged on, Kozhedub's name quickly began to spread through the regiment as a pilot to watch. By mid-August, the newest Soviet ace had already claimed 8 victories and earned a promotion to junior lieutenant. His unit soon moved to Kharkiv, where he flew escort missions for Petlyakov PE-2 bombers, supporting the Red Army's advance across war-torn Ukraine. Following a brutal summer, Soviet pilots finally began to gain air supremacy, chipping away at the Luftwaffe's dominance. In intense aerial duels over the Dnieper in the fall, Kozhedub's regiment clashed with Goering's elite Yugoslavia 51 squadron, forcing it into retreat. In a matter of just 10 days, Kozhedub himself shot down 11 enemy aircraft. Aggressive, tireless, and skilled, Kozhedub was the ideal fighter pilot, and his connection with his aircraft was almost spiritual. Every time he approached the cockpit, he spoke to his plane with the same care and devotion. As he once said, quote, "The motor works accurately. The plane is obedient to my every movement. I am not alone. My fighting friend is with me." This dedication propelled him to greater heights, earning him the title of Hero of the Soviet Union on February 4th, 1944. By May, with 38 air victories under his belt, Kozhedub's reputation was rock solid. Upon being promoted to captain and given command of a squadron, frustration set in as he felt the new role would pull him away from the front lines. However, he was posted to the 1st Belarusian Front with the elite 176 Guards Fighter Regiment. Despite his initial doubts, Kozhedub quickly realized that the 176 Guards Fighter Regiment was no ordinary unit. Over the war, it carried out over 9,000 combat missions, with nearly half being lone wolf operations, missions that suited Kozhedub's aggressive style perfectly. His new assignment came with an all-new aircraft, the LA-7. A perfect match for Kozhedub, this model was faster than the LA-5 and more agile. It had a top speed of 411 miles per hour, improved handling, and most importantly, it wielded greater firepower. This quickly proved effective in his initial sorties, where he was often teamed up with aces like Dmitry Titarenko to hunt down enemy aircraft with unmatched ferocity. As he recalled, quote, "Day in and day out, we would fly in the morning and analyze our sorties back at the squadrons at noon. At 9 p.m., we used to gather in the canteen, where the commander gave an account of the results of the day." But not all missions ended as planned. During a fierce skirmish over enemy territory, Kozhedub's LA-7 took a critical hit, and the engine suddenly came to a stop. Undeterred, he angled the nose downward and aimed at a clearing below, diving faster and faster. Thankfully, just as he was about to meet the ground, the engine roared back to life, and with a sharp pull on the stick, the pilot leveled off mere feet above the treetops, then banked gently and returned to base unscathed and ready to serve another day. For the rest of the year, Kozhedub's results cemented his reputation as a leader. In late September 1944, the Soviet Air Force dispatched Kozhedub and his regiment to the Baltic, tasked with facing off against a squadron of German aces led by Major Helmut Wieck. Nazi propaganda proudly advertised that this squadron had claimed over 130 victories, a number sure to intimidate any opposition. And while the squadron leader and his men knew the odds were stacked against them, they didn't flinch. Sure enough, in a matter of only a week, Kozhedub picked off 3 of Germany's most prized aces. His comrades added another 9 to the tally, losing only 2 in return. With the Luftwaffe reeling from a crushing 2-12 loss, this decisive defeat from only 1 squadron led the Germans to significantly scale back their operations over the Baltic coast. That same November, Kozhedub led just 8 of his fighters against a seemingly unstoppable force of 30 fast and agile Focke-Wulf FW-190s. Outnumbered nearly 4-1, the Soviet pilots pressed forward without hesitation, moving in perfect synchronization. By the end of the chaotic dogfight, 8 German planes had been torn from the sky, 3 of them by the squadron leader's own hand. Once, while flying over Iași, Romania, he spotted a group of 30 German bombers and dove straight in, shooting down 2 before being surrounded by enemy fighters. Out of ammo, and with no reinforcements, he instead relied on a series of clever steep climbs and dives to keep them at bay, pushing his plane to its limits until he finally broke free and escaped. By the end of the year, Captain Ivan Kozhedub had a total of 48 confirmed victories. Still, there were probably many more that went unreported. Unlike other aces who eagerly tallied every potential victory, sometimes exaggerating their numbers, Kozhedub only recorded those he saw crash to the ground with his own eyes, not counting the ones he downed with his wingman's help. Even when others insisted that a shot-down plane should be added to his record, he would simply shake his head and humbly reply, quote, "What if it landed safely?" Despite the dozens of victories, the captain's success in the skies never went to his head. While others sought every praise and recognition available, Kozhedub remained humble, focused on the mission, and loyal to his squadron, and most importantly, the fight against the Nazi forces. By early 1945, the once mighty Luftwaffe had been shattered, and Allied forces were closing in on Berlin. But the Germans still had one trump card left, the Messerschmitt Me-262. The world's first operational jet fighter, it was capable of speeds over 540 miles per hour, faster than anything the Allies had in the air. Armed with 4 30mm cannons and devastating rocket payloads, the Me-262 was built to tear through bomber formations and wreak havoc on Allied air superiority. To most, the jet seemed invincible, but not to Ivan Kozhedub. On February 19th, while flying a lone wolf mission north of Frankfurt with his wingman Dmitry Titarenko, Kozhedub noticed a glint of silver at 2,170 feet, a jet flying low and fast along the Oder River. An even more extraordinary pilot was flying the unusual aircraft. It was Karl Long, one of the Luftwaffe's most celebrated aces, boasting 180 victories to his name. For months, Long had stalked the skies, eager to bring down the elusive Soviet pilot once and for all. But now, his prey was the one with the upper hand. Ivan made a sharp turn and began pursuing the Me-262 at full throttle, knowing he couldn't catch it in a straight chase. Titarenko fired first, forcing the jet to bank left, right into Kozhedub's sights. Without hesitation, the top Soviet ace lined up the shot and squeezed the trigger. In an instant, the Me-262 transformed into a fireball, its supposed invincibility shattered by the skill and precision of a propeller-driven LA-7. While some debate the details, this event is still considered one of the earliest cases of a jet being downed by a propeller-driven aircraft. As the war began to wrap up, the Soviet pilot continued his antics. Late in February 1945, Major Kozhedub and Lieutenant Gromykovsky were patrolling the front lines when they spotted 13 Focke-Wulf aircraft below. Without hesitation, they dove in and attacked. Kozhedub downed 3 German planes, while Gromykovsky added 2 more to the tally. But it wasn't just the Luftwaffe that Kozhedub tangled with. In one very controversial incident on April 17, 1945, while defending a group of American B-17 flying fortresses under attack, Kozhedub's LA-7 was mistaken for the enemy. When a couple of American P-51 Mustang fighters turned on him, he had no other choice but to fire back, taking down 2 of them in a friendly fire incident. Although said incident remains unconfirmed, it became part of the lore surrounding his career. That same day, during his 5th sortie over Berlin, Kozhedub and his wingman suddenly encountered a massive group of 40 FW-190s, loaded with bombs and heading for Soviet ground forces. As the pilot recalled, quote, "The odds were obviously not in our favor, but we decided to attack since the enemy aircraft were heading for our troops." Using the cover of clouds, Kozhedub and Titarenko closed in at maximum speed and fired almost point-blank at one of the German wingmen. The FW-190 spiraled down into the city below. In response, the rest of the German formation immediately tightened into a defensive circle, each plane covering the tail of the one ahead. But Kozhedub and Titarenko didn't hold back, and they dove straight through the enemy's formation, tearing a wedge into the defensive circle and causing chaos. Panicked, the Germans jettisoned their bombs, convinced they were under attack from a far larger force, not just 2 daring Soviet fighters. And while Titarenko shot down another FW-190 as they turned to leave, as they prepared to head home, Kozhedub spotted yet another bomber. Reaching the enemy on the recovery from his dive, pilot Kozhedub hit it just in time, and according to him, quote, "The plane literally burst in the air." When they finally landed, their fuel tanks were nearly empty, but Kozhedub's personal score had risen to 62 downed enemy aircraft. By the end of World War II, Ivan Kozhedub completed 330 combat sorties, engaging in 120 aerial battles and achieving 62 confirmed victories, the highest number of air combat victories for any Soviet pilot during the war. His unparalleled skill, particularly in deflection shooting, made him a legend. After the conflict, Kozhedub continued serving the Soviet Air Force. During the Korean War, he commanded the 324th Fighter Air Division. Although forbidden from flying combat missions himself, under his leadership, the division claimed 239 victories, including 12 B-29 bombers with minimal losses, this time against the United States and its allies. Kozhedub continued serving and was eventually promoted to the rank of Marshal of Aviation before finally retiring in 1985.